This dispute is an example of the kind of self-imposed handicap that no country is going to be able to afford in the next few difficult years ahead. We ask our fellow citizens, in whatever industry they work, to remember their common citizenship.
This is the story of four momentous years in British politics. It began in 1973, when a Conservative government, led by Edward Heath, was in power.
We trust that faced with the consequences of not doing that, our nation will unite to face the future.
Massive oil price increases during 1973, followed by industrial action by the mine workers in the winter of that year, had led the Prime Minister to call a 3-day week. The Labour Party, under the leadership of Harold Wilson, had spent over 3 years in opposition.
But one thing they know, Britain's economic crisis was the worst in our history even before a single miner began his overtime ban, even before there was any interference with our oil supplies. And the same will be true the moment that the coal dispute is settled. But as they approach...
With Tony Benn as Shadow Minister for Trade and Industry, Labour had developed alternative policies to fight Britain's economic decline, including a radical industrial strategy. Against the tide, the record of Labour's retreat from those policies is based on Tony Benn's diaries for those crucial years.
This volume of the diaries covers the period from the beginning of 73, which was the last year of Ted Heath, to the end of 76, when the Labour cabinet, by capitulating to the bankers, really cut its own throat. And therefore it is quite an interesting period in British politics. The first chapter relates to the end of the Heath government, when a number of interesting things were happening. Heath had done his U-turn back towards the policies of the post-war consensus. There'd been this huge increase in the oil prices, which has obviously given the miners great bargaining power. He went for a statutory pay policy, came into conflict with the miners, introduced a 3-day week that wasn't necessary, took the issue to the country as on the question of who governs Britain. The public, or the electors, then supported Labour, and we just got in on a minority.
As many of you will have heard already, Her Majesty the Queen agreed today to my request that Parliament should be dissolved. As a result, there will now be a general election on February the 28th. The issue before you is a simple one.
The government have been so obsessed with the prospect of a run-for-it election that they neglected or rejected any hope of an industrial solution.
The election, fought in dramatic circumstances, led to the defeat of the Conservative Party. Tony Benn was returned as Member of Parliament for his Bristol South East constituency, but he left for London not knowing who would form the next government.
We arrived in London, and there was a message from Wilson, as far as I remember. Nobody was to make a statement over the weekend because we didn't have an overall majority. Heath was trying to get Jeremy Thorpe to form a coalition, and in the end, the Shadow Cabinet met, I think, on the Monday or whatever, and I was sent away with Shirley Williams, of all people, to write a paper as to why we shouldn't have a coalition, because I was absolutely opposed. You see, Thorpe wanted us to go in with Heath and have a national government, and I've always been opposed to that, although I think there were people in the Labour government would have liked it. So then I went into my department. It was tremendously dramatic, because I remember going home and listening on the news, and it said on the news, ministers are leaving their departments. It was rather like a sort of revolution where you heard the enemy were deserting the capital and you were moving in. It was tremendous. And then I had a message after sitting by the telephone, which is one of the most agonizing things you can do. One, if you didn't get a job. I was told to go to the Department of Industry, and I rang up my permanent secretary and told him, and he thought it was a very minor job. He thought I'd been downgraded to a sort of Minister of State. I followed Peter Walker, and of course I went into the office, and there were the same private secretaries who had been drafting the angry letters from Peter Walker to me during the 3-day week, and it was really an astonishing experience to go into the office. I got a banner from Transport House, the workers' union, and I hung it on the wall. And I think a lot of the senior civil servants thought the revolution had arrived. There was this huge banner which said, "He who would be free must strike the blow." And there was David and Goliath. earth. And I hung it up there, and my permanent secretary came in quivering, almost like somebody surrendering at the end of a war. And then he said to me, I take it, Minister, you won't be implementing your policy. And of course I will be.
As Secretary of State for Industry, Tony Benn had the task of implementing Labour's industrial policy. There was a new and radical approach to the private sector and the creation of a National Enterprise Board.
The National Enterprise Board was a product of a report done by Judith Hart and Stuart Holland and Tony Banks and others under the Home Policy Committee, of which I was chairman. And it was an attempt to look at the experience of the period 66 or 64 to 70 afresh. That the idea of the mixed economy as it had been interpreted previously was that you'd have a public sector and a private sector. Some would be nationalised public utilities and others wouldn't be, and so on. We tried to breathe life into the idea of a mixed economy based on size. That the really big companies, which produced about 70% of our output and exports and so on, would either be publicly owned or publicly accountable through planning agreements. Now, it had to be on the basis of being voluntary. That was a weakening of the policy which Wilson and the Cabinet insisted upon. But as a matter of fact, government had so much in a way to offer through a planning agreement, and the trade unions were so strong within companies that you could have had a planning agreement which made their planning correspond to a national interest that was quite definable. You wanted to increase production, you wanted to see you paid your way and so on. And lower down, you had the broad range of statutory responsibilities to the consumer, to the community, to the employee, and so on. And then, as I say, at the bottom, you don't, and with the small businessman on quite a different basis, you treat him as a worker, because he was.
One aspect of your policy that was roundly condemned by leaders of industry and the media was support for worker cooperatives. How did you develop your attitude towards industrial democracy?
Yes, I mean, all my ideas came out of experience, and if I go back for a moment to the period when I was Minister of Technology from 66 to 70, I mean, I was then working loyally to implement the policy of mergers and cooperation with governments on. It was terribly bureaucratic, terribly unfair and inefficient, and it was at that stage that I began seeing more clearly, because I'm a slow learner, that it was the industrial franchise that mattered. When we came to power in 74, the whole of British manufacturing industry was in a state of crisis. The three-day week had done it damage, the inflation was hitting it, and there were major collapses. But some companies, tending to be smaller ones, when they went bankrupt, decided to set up cooperatives, and I supported them. The notable one was the Triumph Cooperative in Meriden. Then the Scottish Daily News was founded when Beaverbrook pulled out, and then the third one was up in Liverpool. And what I tried to do there was to support the workers in a closure situation instead of the management. And I remember one occasion when one of the shop stewards said to me at a meeting, "Look, our problem, Tony, is that we can't read a balance sheet, and it's very difficult for us to cope." And I said, "Well, I can't read a balance sheet. The difference between you and me is that I can hire people who can read one because I'm a minister, you can't. So I will hire people who can read a balance sheet to help you to preserve your jobs." And for the first time employed consultants to assist shop stewards to maintain their production instead of sitting there while consultants were employed by management to tell me why they had to close the plant. And this, of course, caused a terrible outcry. My officials would come in and say, "Minister, we're afraid that what you're doing will damage the cooperative idea because these are companies that are in difficulties and you don't want to associate cooperation with companies in decline." And actually what they were really saying is they're terrified they would succeed. Because remember, capitalism depends upon two disciplines. The discipline of sacking people individually if they misbehave, and the closure of a plant if it's not economic. And if by the cooperative movement you could have a phoenix-like recreation of a firm out of the ashes of a capitalist collapse, then of course it would undermine the disciplines of capitalism. So they were absolutely furious, and of course the trade union leaders were worried because a cooperative didn't quite fit in with the structure of trade unionism in bargaining with capital. After all, in a cooperative, capital disappears, and the cooperative is both the manager and the workforce working as one. And there's one very amusing example of this. The Common Market offered £25,000 to us as a department if we would put £25,000.
Department of Industry.
Department of Industry. If we would put money in to study the movement in and out of the labour market in South Wales. And the plan was we'd give £50,000 to some professor who'd write a scholarly piece which would gather dust on the bookshelves of all the universities in Britain. And I said, it's a marvellous idea, but instead of giving the money to a professor, I will give the money in £500 blocks to shop stewards to take a short sabbatical to study their experience. They will know what's going on, they'll write a short paper, and then a few months later they'll go back and apply what they've learned. Oh, there was a terrible row. My permanent secretary said, I'm going to report you to the Public Accounts Committee for something that, in a sense, bordered on corruption. But not only that, because it was okay to give money to professors, but not to shop stewards. And then I was summoned by Len Murray at the TUC. He said, you've no right to give money to shop stewards without my permission. So here was the permanent secretary of my department, who was hostile to what I was doing anyway, and the general secretary of the TUC coalescing to prevent me from funding what was academic research of a highly relevant kind among people who really knew what was happening to movement of labour or movement of capital in and out of the labour market, because they were losing their jobs because it was moving out, and wanting to get jobs by bringing it in. So one could detect this coalition of forces which people notice but don't ever quite understand. And this was, of course, very, very threatening to the whole idea of a market economy and multinationals and capital, and got me into trouble with the unions, with the government, but above all made the CBI absolutely hate me.
It wasn't only the CBI and the media which were opposed to the industrial policy. There was also fierce resistance from within Tony Benn's own department.
I've no doubt whatever that the civil servants were opposed to it. And remember this about the British civil service, which is a point that needs to be made generally. When you get into office, you move into a department which has got the same permanent secretary, the same private secretary, the same deputy secretaries that your political opponents have had until a week ago. Indeed, until a day ago. You just move into the office. So obviously those civil servants have been responsible for fashioning the policies you've been elected to reverse. Now, they try and get round it by sending these briefs for incoming ministers, which are very, very simple. They read your manifesto, they try and interpret it in terms of what they want to do anyway, and they offer a deal to a minister, really. The deal is, if you do what we want you to do, we'll help you to pretend you're doing what you said you'd do. That's the nature of the deal. I would never accept it. And from that moment on, they became hostile in a very major way. Now, I could have coped with that as Secretary of State, call them in and say, you do that, you do that. But of course, they then moved out of my department, went straight to the Treasury, used the Whitehall net, briefed other ministers through the civil service net to come and complain about what I was doing, knew they could rely on the Prime Minister to support them. And no minister can defeat Whitehall when Whitehall works across the whole board and knows the Prime Minister sympathetic, as he was, to what they were doing. So, I mean, I can't really pretend it was the civil service that defeated me. They made it difficult. But actually, they really were relying upon political support against what I was trying to do from the very highest minister, the Prime Minister, and from other ministers who took the same view. Funnily enough, I don't think that Whitehall thought that I would be reappointed Secretary of State for Industry after the second election, because every incoming minister gets a brief from the civil servants. It's a very important document that very few people read because they're very tired and they're very busy, but it comes when an election is over from the civil servants. And I had mine, of course, in March 74. In October 74, I got these briefs. They always say on them for an incoming Labour administration, and they've got another set in case there's an incoming Conservative administration. One of the briefs that reached me was for an incoming Labour Secretary of State for Industry other than Mr. Benn. So they had prepared three briefs. A brief for the Tories if they won, a brief for the person they thought would succeed, which was later Mr. Varley, of course, and I got the wrong brief. And what it told me was that from then on they were really preparing a major assault upon the policy. One strange aspect of the frustration that the civil servants tried to impose on me arose in respect of an accounting officer minute. Now, in addition to being permanent secretary of a department, the permanent secretary also has responsibilities to the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Commons and the Controller and Auditor General, who audit the books. And normally a civil servant is supposed to do what the Secretary of State tells him. But if he disagrees with it, he can put in what's called an accounting officer minute of one kind, saying that I have doubts about this, and the Secretary of State then writes back and says, well, do it anyway, and when the permanent secretary appears before the Public Accounts Committee, he says, I did it under instructions. So that acquits him. There is another sharper type of accounting officer minute, which implies that the minister has done something that in some ways is improper, which is rather different from being an unusual use of policy. And on one occasion, I had a letter from number 10, actually it appeared in the paper first, followed by a letter from number 10, saying that the permanent secretary had sent me an accounting officer minute of the second kind, which was a very serious thing to happen. My private secretary was totally sympathetic to me, went through the records and said, well, this isn't really the case. We've had a number of notes from the permanent secretary, but in every case we've taken account of what he said. And the argument rotated around whether the projects that I was supporting were viable. Because if you weren't supporting viable projects, then was it in any way proper to spend the money? So I went back, with the help of my private secretary, I went back over all the other projects that had come forward to government over many, many years and found, of course, that many of them had never been viable. I mean, Concord had never been viable. Nuclear power had never been viable. And I asked, were accounting officer minutes sent about them? Well, they weren't. So then I wrote back to the Prime Minister and I said, first of all, I took account of all the points that were made. But secondly, I discover that accounting officer minutes have never been sent before, although many projects were embarked upon because they were thought desirable but were not necessarily viable. I said it is significant that the only time that they've ever raised this question was when the government was supporting labour rather than capital. You could pour money into private firms and nobody ever raised any question. But in my case, I was supporting the cooperatives, I was supporting the trade unions in trying to maintain employment. And on that occasion, and I said, therefore, it is a politically motivated minute. And the whole matter was dropped. But it was a very, very unusual and a very difficult bit of opposition to undertake, because it was in a way below the belt. It implied that I was behaving improperly. Actually what it was revealing totally and completely the bias of the civil service machine against anything that assisted labour.
Isn't there another way of looking at these arguments with the Prime Minister and your civil servants? Since you were elected as a minority government, do you think it would have been better not to have rocked the boat?
The idea of all Labour Prime Ministers has been, if you are a minister, you have only one duty, to discuss secretly with colleagues what should be done, and once the Cabinet's decided, to advocate it. And this is embodied in a procedure note sent round. And I wrote my own, and I discussed it with people in my department. And I said, we are ministers, but we're also individuals. We're members of the party, we're members of our unions. We have a duty to explain what's going on. We have a duty to say when we can't do what has to be done, what we'd like to do next, that the future belongs to all of us, even if the present policies are being determined by the Cabinet. And this did lead to a conflict. I was accused, of course, as you quite properly say, of not being a member of the team. But as a matter of fact, I think that when you become a Prime Minister, and even many ministers follow this, you leave the team. And you then just go on doing what you're told. And that is not a very satisfactory or democratic arrangement. It explains most of the difficulties the Labour Party's got in with its own supporters.
In October 1974, Harold Wilson decided to go to the country. Labour had been in power for just 7 months.
Political opponents, but the full weight...
In the election, they were returned to government, this time with a small overall majority. Tony Benn remained in his post of Secretary of State for Industry.
What we have put forward to the electorate in this election is a program of radical democratic socialist change which we intend to implement in the new parliament. And one thing that really has...
2 issues were to overshadow his remaining time there: the struggle to rescue Labour's industrial strategy and the referendum campaign to remove Britain from the common market. In your diary for October 1974, you say you have two objectives in the next 12 months. One is to get Britain out of Europe, and the other to get your industrial policy across. Why did you fail?
They failed because there wasn't support for them. The British establishment cares more about locking Britain into the EC than any other single thing, for the very simple reason that they see it as the final guarantee that Britain, under any government, could never adopt socialist policies, because it would be illegal under the Treaty of Rome. And therefore the coalition in favour of going in was a huge and powerful coalition. It included all the party leaders. It was on the European question later that the SDP broke away from the Labour Party, because for them Europe was more important really than working with the Labour movement at home. In a sense, the referendum was the third general election. We'd won the first one in 74 with a minority, the second one with a tiny majority in the October. And I think one has to see the May 1975 referendum as a third election, when actually the Labour Party was defeated, but the government continued. There were many struggles. The first was to get the right to have a referendum, which had led Roy Jenkins to resign the deputy leadership earlier when the party accepted it. Second one was to get the right for ministers who disagreed to argue publicly, the so-called agreement to differ, and that led to the dissenting ministers. And when the Cabinet met in March 1975 to consider the so-called renegotiated terms, there was an overwhelming majority in the Cabinet for accepting them. They were really quite fraudulent, actually. They hadn't been renegotiated at all. And immediately the campaign against membership began. The conference met, opposed membership. And those of us who were dissenting ministers, Michael Foot, Barbara Castle, myself, Peter Shaw, and one or two others, had no resources, and we were fighting the best financed campaign I've ever come across in my life, with our own leader and the Tory leader and the Liberal leader united, a coalition. And of course during that period, it ended with the referendum in the early summer. During that period, many of the policies I'd been developing in the Department of Industry were coming to a head. So it was quite unparalleled in the hostility. You had you were fighting the common market, you were fighting the CBI, you were fighting the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and of course the other parties, and Fleet Street was quite hysterical. During the election, Heath said that if Britain withdrew, we would end up as an Eastern European type state, which was a ludicrous bit of scaremongering. But it would have confirmed the policy that we'd been following. It would have meant we would have had to tackle our own problems instead of leaving it to Brussels. I think the world bankers would have put the pressure on, but still, if the people had spoken, and of course if they'd been allowed to know the arguments, they might very well have spoken that way, it would have been a turning point, much, much more important than the election victories of 74, the two of them in March and October. At the end, having argued for the referendum, I had to accept the result. But I accepted the result in the way one accepts a defeat in a general election. That's the defeat for today. Now you go on and try and bring it forward again. And personally, of course, it meant that I was removed from my work at the moment it was coming to fruition. On the Monday after the referendum, which was the 9th of June, I went to hear Harold make his statement on the referendum, and afterwards in the tea room, I heard he wanted to see me at 6. I walked over to number 10 and went into the cabinet room where Harold was waiting, looking very brown and relaxed. I sat some way away from him, and he said, "I'll come straight to the point. I'd like you to take energy. It's a very important department dealing with North Sea oil. The negotiations of the oil companies are underway with Harold Lever and Edmund Dell. It involves the miners, whom you know very well. It involves nuclear power, which you know inside out. And that's what I want you to take. You've got a lot of energy, if you know what I mean," he said, smiling. I didn't smile. "You'd enjoy it," he said. "It's a very important job." I said nothing. "Well, haven't you got any questions?" "No," I replied, "except how long you're going to give me to think about it." "I must know soon, 2 hours. "Overnight," I said. "Oh, no," he said, "got to know by 9:45. "Well, my wife is away till 10, and I want to discuss it with her, so what about 10:15? "9:45, he insisted. "I'll see you in the lobby at 10 tonight." "All right." I picked up my coat, and Ron drove me back to the house. I said to Roy Williams, who was my private secretary, clear up my office, remove my banner, take everything out of it as if I'd never been there. I invited Stephen and Hilary to come to the house because I wanted their advice. I rang Caroline, but she was at a governor's meeting at Holland Park School, so Melissa, bless her heart, went all the way to the school and pulled Caroline out. Caroline's first thought was that I'd been assassinated, which in a way I had. So that's the end of Tuesday, the 18th of July, 1980. Wednesday, the 19th of July, 1989. Well, Granada were here in the morning, but I didn't have time to do any work with them before I went off to the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting, which was held in room 14.
Against the Tide is based on Tony Benn's own diaries of the period. When did he start keeping a record of his political activity?
In the 50s, I kept manuscript notes. I've always kept a sort of a private diary anyway, but I kept manuscript notes and sometimes dictated the events of the day to a secretary. When I went into the cabinet in the summer of 1966, I felt, because the Official Secrets Act shows how proper I was, I couldn't dictate what happened to the cabinet to a secretary who was not a Privy Councillor. So there was a sort of gap. Then I began in January 68 dictating every night. So there was the tape diary, the diary notes where you had all your engagements, and then I would attach to it not just my notes but all the documents. It might be National Executive minutes or it might be this or that, so you can go back and find the background to everything. Then in addition to that, developed a little bit, in January 1974, as the election was coming up and I was under very, very heavy pressure, I began tape recording public speeches and broadcasts, not private discussions, obviously, but anything public, an interview with a journalist, a broadcast, a lecture, a speech at a public meeting. You can either follow a story all the way through, like nuclear power, by taking the floppy disk on which the tape is typed and melt away everything except a particular story, so you can read it, or you can zoom in on a particular day, as with a zoom lens, and blow it up with the photographs. There may be film, there may be video, there'll be the notes, there'll be the cassettes, and the whole thing can then be examined microscopically. I never intended to publish, but they've been my working papers. I've used them all my life. Dig something out when you wanted it, fitted it into what you wanted to say. And I see it as a study of experience, but also as providing some sort of a guide to see you don't make the same mistakes a second time. Then I went upstairs, I checked through my diary, I did a few letters, and I got home about 1 o'clock and went to bed about 1:30. So it was a busy day, but an interesting one.
The referendum on the Common Market was held in June 1975. A few days after the result, Tony Benn was sacked by Harold Wilson as Secretary of State for Industry. Instead, he was offered the position of Energy Secretary with a seat in the Cabinet. Do you think you should have accepted the post as Energy Secretary?
I wondered about it at the time and consulted a lot of people. It was a very hot day or two, and we were in my room in the House of Commons, and people kept coming in and coming out and giving advice and so on. In the end, I went to Bristol, and I asked the General Management Committee of the Bristol South East Labour Party what they thought I should do. They had a discussion which they permitted me to record, not very clear, but it is recorded, and in the end they decided I should stay in the Cabinet and fight it out. There certainly are people, even today, in the Labour Party who said you should have resigned then, not accepted it. But when I look back on it, I'm not sure they were right for a number of reasons. First of all, if I had resigned and there had been a vote of confidence in the House that evening in the government, I'd have had to vote for it, because I wanted the government to survive. If there'd then been an election and I'd stood as a Labour candidate, which I would have expected to do, I'd have to say vote Labour, knowing quite well the government from which I'd resigned would go back into office. But apart from that, I thought to myself, why should I leave the field to people who don't believe in the policy? And I'm sure it was right to stay, though it was an agonizing period, not just then but later, because I was able to argue the case right through in 76 on the cuts, and 78 in the winter of discontent, and so on. But it is a difficult question, resignation. And I suppose if there is a principle one should adhere to, it is that you should only resign from a cabinet if you have come to the conclusion that the cabinet you're a member of, or the government you're a member of, or the party you're a member of, is no longer the lesser of two evils. And that's a very big decision to take.
In the cabinet meeting at Chequers in 1974, one of the big topics of discussion was nuclear power. At that time, you supported nuclear power. So why did you change your views?
At that time, and certainly when I went into it in '66, I was working with a generation of scientists who were so pleased to be out of the military program and in the civil program that I was very enthusiastic about it. In general, I believed that it was cheap, that it was safe, and that it was peaceful. And what I learned by hard experience was it wasn't cheap. I mean, we now know with the privatization of electricity, the nuclear power is 40% more expensive than the coal mines which have been closed on economic grounds. It isn't safe, not only Chernobyl, but we've had a series of very serious accidents in this country, notably the fire at Windscale. And it isn't peaceful, most important of all, because the whole time that I was there, plutonium that had come out of our civil power stations was going to America to go to make warheads in the American nuclear program. The costing of the nuclear power program was really fraudulent. To start with, the research and development, the basic research and development, was covered by the defense program, because after all it was the defense program that launched the civil program. Secondly, they never compared like with like, though I did force them on one occasion to do a strict comparison between a big coal-fired station and a big nuclear station, and there was nothing in it. But what they used to do would be to compare brand new nuclear stations, which were quite big, with old-fashioned coal-fired stations that were coming to the end of their useful life. The third thing they could never take into account was the decommissioning cost of nuclear power stations, because we'd never decommissioned them. Now we know that it's about two-thirds as expensive to decommission a nuclear power station as it is to build one. So all these ongoing costs have still to be borne, and then for 100 or 200 years, it's going to be unsafe to go into the old nuclear power stations because they'll still be alive with dangerous radioactivity. So I think all the costings were fraudulent, and they've come out as a byproduct of privatization, because frankly, if you privatize nuclear power, who's going to invest in it? It's not profitable. So they've now had to admit nuclear power is 40% more expensive than coal, and then they've got to have a subsidy, which we will have to pay, to make it worthwhile selling off the nuclear power stations to a private employer. The whole nuclear dream, if that's how you describe it, or nightmare, is coming to an end. And I remember an American saying to me in the White House, O'Leary, a very distinguished American engineer who'd been chairman of the Federal Power Commission, he said in 100 years there'll be no nuclear power in the world. I found it hard to believe it at the time. I'm quite persuaded now that's correct.
You were heavily criticised by the left for the cabinet decision to accept uranium from Namibia.
Oh, the uranium from Namibia was a really interesting story. We were looking for uranium, and they came to me and they said that RTZ have got a mine in Canada, and they want to order it from there. And I said, fine. And they said, we might possibly have to shift it, and we'll come back and tell you if we do. I then discovered, in this would be the spring of 1970, that they had shifted it. They had shifted the order from the mine in Canada, not to South Africa, which would have been bad enough, but to Namibia, which was occupied illegally by South Africa. They had signed the contract. This was the Atomic Energy Authority, had signed the contract. And they told me that to cancel the contract would involve a huge cancellation charge. And one error I made, I never forgive myself for, though in the event it wouldn't have made a difference because they wouldn't have accepted my alternative view. I said to the cabinet, well, we've got no choice but to go ahead. But it rankled with me and worried me, and I got the Labour Party in opposition to pledge they would cancel the contract. And when I got back to energy in the summer of 1975, I began the process. And in January 1976, I was told to put in a paper saying we needed more uranium from the Rossing mine, and I said we should find it elsewhere and cancel. It was one of the most unpleasant cabinet committees I've ever attended. I mean, they really did turn the flamethrower on me, and I lost the battle. And I now, looking back on it, I can see so many other dimensions. First of all, here was a major contract signed without telling the minister. And they would have known my view about Namibia because I've been involved in the anti-colonial movement for a long time. Secondly, I realized why they shifted it from Canada. In Canada, the Canadian government, being very responsible, would never sell uranium without end-use safeguards, i.e. we would have had to promise them that we'd never use it for bombs, whereas South Africa had no such limitation because in return they were getting a capacity to build the nuclear weapon themselves, which I think they have a capacity to do, and it was from Namibia. And also there were other aspects of it. It wasn't until later I realized that the health hazards of mining uranium are enormous, but because it doesn't happen in this country, people don't care about it. But I mean, when we talk about the environmental cost of nuclear power, nobody ever speaks about the hazards that are experienced by people who actually mine the uranium. So that was a very unhappy episode, and for one for which I was responsible in the sense that I should have said to the Cabinet, cancel it. I don't think the Cabinet would have agreed, actually, but that's not the point. The point, I should have said it. And when I did try to cancel it, I was quite unable to do so, despite a clear pledge in the manifesto that we would do so, or in the Labour programme in 1976 we would do so.
It was a great shock to many people when in March 1976, Harold Wilson announced his resignation. He had been leader of the Labour Party since 1963, and in many ways the most successful leader in its history. Were you surprised when Harold Wilson resigned?
Yes and no. No, because a year before he resigned, my driver, Ron Vaughan, dead now, lovely man, said to me, the Prime Minister's going to resign. So I said, how do you know? Well, he said, he's given instructions that all previous Prime Ministers are to have a car and a chauffeur for life. So I said, what does that prove? Well, he said, in the old days only the Prime Minister had a car. Then Hume was very generous to Wilson, and as an as a leader of the opposition, gave him a car. But if he resigns, he'll be neither Prime Minister nor leader of the opposition, so he won't have a car. So, in a sense, I was prepared, and also Harold had said to me on a number of occasions, I'll do a couple of years and then I'll go, but I'm very sceptical of political leaders who announce their retirement, because it may be a way of mobilizing support. But we went into the Cabinet on that particular morning, and there was a slight air of excitement about it, I don't know why. And Harold then read a statement. He said, I've decided to hand over to somebody else. And he read a statement, and then he left the Cabinet, went to see the Queen, I think. And there was a press conference and so on. But it was a bombshell. And the thing about him, he was still very young. I mean, he was only 60, which is young for Prime Ministers. He could do the job standing on his head, and in fairness often did. And I went to the dinner at number 10, the farewell dinner for Wilson, and got permission to put my tape recorder on the table.
I remembered that on the 22nd of February 1965, I had a letter from the BBC. Dear Mr. Benn, I am compiling material for a 30-minute biographical programme on Mr. Harold Wilson, to be held in readiness for Home Service transmission in the event of Mr. Wilson's death. And the only answer I'll read is when they said, in the last question, Kenneth Harris, now, Mr. Benn, you've said a great deal in praise of Harold Wilson. What are his shortcomings? And my reply was, well, he was never a backbencher. And now you've put that right, too. And I must say that this... I imagine if the newspapers are right, that we shall be electing a senior politician, and in a few years' time, we'll be looking for a younger man. And I only hope that when you stand again, you don't split the left-wing vote.
It was a very jolly evening, and as we left, Harold said to me, I surprised you by my resignation, didn't I? And then I told the story about the motor car. I said, no, Harold, I knew a year ago. He said, how did you know? So I told the story. And he gave me a very funny look, and Marcia said to me, who was standing next to him, you are a nasty man. And I went out into the darkness, and that was the end of Harold Wilson.
What did you think of Harold Wilson as a leader?
A very interesting man. He was, of course, a civil servant during the war. He was a Liberal as a student. Brilliant civil servant in the Ministry of Fuel and Power. After the war, he was the youngest cabinet minister. I think he was 29 when he became president of the Board of Trade. he masterminded a lot of the post-war planning working with Stafford Cripps. He was treated with utter contempt after his resignation, because when Nye Bevan resigned in '51 over the defence budget, Harold went with him, and Hugh Dalton and others used to describe Harold as Nye's little dog. He was loathed, and he went through a very, very difficult period. He was brilliant in the House, handled statistics. He was a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, handled statistics very well, was very funny, ran rings round Hume, rather admired Macmillan because they were of the same ilk, and then became Prime Minister, having run a campaign of brilliance, talking about the technological revolution, the white heat of technology. He was mocked for it later, as if somehow he was going to go around the economy with a blow lamp fixing it. But what he was actually saying was, which was quite right, if socialism had never been invented, the advent of technology would burn people up. That was the white heat, and unless you planned the introduction of technology, you'd be destroyed by it. His greatest monument will be the Open University, which he was passionately keen on, that technology would give leisure, people should have a second chance, and if he'd done no more in his life than that, it would have been a great achievement. One of his theories was that he was Dr. Wilson, and that people would get on playing bowls and cricket and watching television and leave it all to him. Well, I never believed in that. That was a wholly elitist view, and as a result of arguing against that, he slung me out of his kitchen cabinet. I wrote a lot of his speeches in the early days. And then at the end, the thing became a tragedy of muddle and compromise and double talk. And it was a tragic end, really, for a man who had, after all, fought 5 general elections as party leader and won 4 of them, more even than Mrs. Thatcher's done. And he hoped and believed that he could make Labour the natural party of government. In the end, I'm afraid, he helped to make us the natural party of opposition.
The resignation of Harold Wilson was followed by a contest for the leadership of the Labour Party. Why did Tony Benn decide to take part?
Now, the leadership election had one quite uncovenanted advantage, that being a candidate, I was free to say what I thought. So there was a tiny little weather window, as they call it in the North Sea, where I was free to say publicly that I disagreed with government policy. Didn't last long. I was eliminated in the first ballot, and Jim Callaghan was elected. Well, I suspected he wanted to succeed because he took me to lunch when we were drafting the manifesto in, I think, about 1972 or 3, and he told me that he wanted to go back to farming. He said, I'm getting on a bit, Tony, you know, I'm fed up and I think I'd like to retire. So I said, well, we'll discuss it when you form your 3rd administration, Jim. And he looked a bit surprised because the Cincinnatus figures, always going back to the farm, must really be about something else. And Jim was a very, very skillful political operator, must say that. He and I had, again, I'd known him since before I was elected to Parliament. The BBC, I used to do interviews for me, for the North American service and so on. And there was a period when Harold thought that Jim was trying to destabilise him. And Jim was very much the bogeyman in Harold's book in about 1966, I think. And I got on very well with Jim at that time. A more open person. The thing about Harold was that he would sound like a Nairn Bevan at the Labour conference and sound like Reg Prentice in the cabinet. And I once said this to Jim after he became Prime Minister. I pointed this out and said, I much prefer you, Jim. And he said, oh, why? Well, I said, you sound like Reg Prentice at public meetings and in the cabinet. So his face fell a bit. But in the end, of course, relations with him got fairly strained. And it was political and not personal. But he had an attractive quality to him, Uncle Jim, Jim will fix it. Rather like Herbert Morrison, he had a little bird on his shoulder all the time who was whispering in his ear what the public would put up with and what they wouldn't put up with. He once said to me, I'm not as nice as I look. So I said, well, neither am I. And on that basis, we got on quite well. And I look back at him with affection, though I doubt whether he would reciprocate.
James Callaghan became leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister in April 1976. Denis Healey, one of the unsuccessful candidates, remained as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Throughout that year, Britain's economic crisis worsened, and the government came under increasing pressure to make drastic cuts in public spending.
Did any of you in the Cabinet at the time feel worried about the economic crisis, or do you think it was something that was pushed very much to the side?
Oh no, the economic crisis was dominant. Indeed, I think looking at the comparison between Tory and Labour governments, the fact is Tories just ride all these things because they know they'll have the permanent confidence of the bankers, so they may have to change course a little bit, but they never talk about it. Labour chancellors were always coming and telling us we had to bite the bullet, face the harsh realities of the situation and so on, which was simply an excuse for adopting Tory policies. And I took a view which I think was surprising for a left-wing minister. I used to take a graver view than the Chancellor. I always used to say the Chancellor's view doesn't really take account of the enormity of the problems of deindustrialisation that face us. If you were more gloomy than the Chancellor, then it completely destroyed his argument, oh, well, you know, Tony just thinks it's easy. I'd say, no, it's much more difficult than you think, because until we get this industrial policy right, till we can get investment into industry, till we can find a democratic answer to the problems of management trying to oppress labour and so on, we're never going to get it right. So that, in fact, from the very, very beginning, I was putting in major alternative economic papers. And in February 1975, I put in a paper that really encapsulated the alternative policy, a paper called Strategy A and Strategy B. Strategy A was the policy they were following, which I warned would lead to a break with the labour movement and our possible defeat. Strategy B was the alternative policy. And the battles over the industrial and broad economic policies were a continuing theme. They were always central, because they were trying to use the economic crisis, as they spoke about it, to drive us off from socialist solutions. And from the summer of 75 to December 76, that 18-month period was the time when the bankers turned the screw. We were safely locked into Europe. We couldn't do anything about it, and they tightened the screw. Of course, if we'd been tough, the North Sea oil was bubbling ashore. I tried to persuade the Treasury to publish not just the gold and dollar reserves, but the gold and dollar and oil reserves, which would have shown us to be enormously rich. But they didn't want it to look as if we were strong economically, because they were preparing to bow down to the bankers' demands to make public expenditure cuts, because that's what they wanted to do anyway.
It seems what you're saying is that everything is run by the Treasury.
The Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. People don't quite appreciate this. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is the second minister in the Treasury setup. They live side by side at number 10 Downing Street and number 11 Downing Street. And unless the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are like that, of course, things can't really be done. So that the Treasury had that, always had access to the Prime Minister, but in addition to that, anyone who controls the strings on the money bag has got enormous power. One of the powers the Treasury exercises that, of course, they've got within the department all the economic advisers and civil servants and so on who know it very well. And other ministers are intimidated, if you know what I mean, against putting in papers on major economic policy. Unlike the period 64-70, when I never ventured quite into that field, this time with Francis Cripps and Francis Morel, who were brilliant advisers, I put in papers on central economic policy decisions. Sometimes the Prime Minister would not allow them to be circulated. But on the major occasion of the 1976 cuts, my paper was the first to be discussed. And indeed, it was so good in character that they asked my permission for Francis Cripps to go and talk to the Treasury about it. And I discovered from Nicky Caldor, the economist, that in fact, tucked away in the Treasury in a safe, not to be looked at by anybody, was a paper known as the Unmentionable, which was actually the policy I was putting forward. It was the reserve policy in case all else failed. So that really it was possible during that period to make some impact on the discussions in the Cabinet, because there would be the Chancellor's paper and my paper, collectively written by the advisers and myself, and with the support of some other ministers. So for the first time, I think the Treasury had to justify its policy, and it didn't like it at all. What I said to the Cabinet really was this: we've got a very grave situation. If we follow the present policy, which is public expenditure cuts, we will end up with a confrontation with the trade union movement, which we did. We would end up with a siege economy, and I pointed out the siege we would have if we followed the Cabinet policy was the bankers would be inside the castle and all our supporters would be besieging us. And I said, you've got to take it in a much tougher way. And they said to me, well, yours will be a siege economy. But the one factor that they never wanted to take into account was the fact that at the end of '76 the oil was beginning to bubble ashore. And if anybody had really tried to put the frighteners on a Labour government, we had the oil, if you like, as a weapon. Because remember that most of the oil was in the Middle East, and with the OPEC price increase and the embargo and so on, Western Europe and America was dependent on North Sea oil. And if we'd said to them, look, you threaten us, and we shall not supply oil, and in my opinion, we'd have called their bluff. But we didn't call their bluff. And therefore, in those two tragic cabinet meetings in December 1976, Labour cut its own throat.
Tony Benn came under tremendous fire from the media over his opposition to his government's policies. What was the effect of the press campaign on him and his family?
Personally, it was a very unpleasant experience. I mean, I'm not complaining because I took the attacks as being directed at my politics and not myself, but of course they were presented in the way in which I've described. You were mad, you were dangerous, you were ambitious, you were a communist, you were a hypocrite, and so on. And that campaign was on an enormous scale. And there was a lot of harassment. The children were shouted at outside the home by journalists hoping they'd say something they could report. My rubbish was collected so regularly we began to wonder how, and my son, a very bright lad, put the plastic bags with the paper on a hinged sheet of wood, a piece of wood, so that when people lifted it, a bell rang and we could look and see who was collecting it. It was being collected in a fast car every morning, whether by MI5 or Fleet Street, I never knew. So I bought a shredding machine to put away, deal with secret papers. And the thing was very unpleasant, and it was a sense of siege. The family suffered much more than I did. But it was an attempt, undoubtedly, to extinguish and destroy the person they saw as being responsible for something that they regarded as a threat to their privileges, which it was.
Could your alternative economic strategy have worked?
If you asked me to be detached and reflective, to have followed the alternative policy would have been very difficult. You would have had really to have done a lot of explanation that had never occurred. Socialism hasn't really been advocated in a serious way in my lifetime. At the end of the war, there was the welfare capitalism that Attlee introduced with the support of the Liberals and the Conservatives, the National Health Service, the welfare state, trade union rights, and so on. But in terms of any type of social transformation where re-equipment would have been got into industry without the vagaries of the market economy, where trade unionists would have had their rights, these things were not discussed. But certainly to have taken the course I recommended in '75 and '76 would have involved a very, very substantially different explanation of the crisis from the one that we've had almost from every government since 1945 to today.